It began with a document that was never meant to leave a private desk at Highgrove. A routine legal review suddenly turned into something far more explosive when palace insiders noticed a name that had quietly disappeared from one of King Charles's most closely guarded family arrangements. At first, aides dismissed the whispers. Then came the confirmation that sent shockwaves through royal circles. Camilla had been removed and nobody saw it coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Highgrove had occupied a unique place within the royal story. It was not merely another estate attached to the crown. It was deeply personal. It represented decades of careful planning, private reflection, and the vision King Charles had cultivated long before he ascended the throne. That is precisely why the rumors that began circulating through palace corridors were treated with such caution. Those Fami, liar with royal affairs, understood that changes connected to Highgrove were rarely minor administrative matters. Every adjustment carried weight. Every signature had consequences. Every decision revealed something about the future. The first indications that something unusual was happening emerged quietly. Senior advisors were reportedly summoned to a meeting that had not appeared on any public schedule. No announcement accompanied the gathering. No explanation followed. Yet the unusual concentration of legal and financial specialists immediately attracted attention among those who monitor the monarchy's inner workings. Questions began to spread. Why had these particular advisors been called together? What required such discretion? And why were trusted palace figures suddenly refusing to discuss matters they would normally dismiss without hesitation? As the days passed, the atmosphere surrounding Highgrove became increasingly difficult to ignore. Administrative activity reportedly nifid behind the scenes. Documents were reviewed. Historical arrangements were revisited. Long-standing trust structures were allegedly examined line by line. To outside observers, nothing appeared different. Public engagements continued. Official schedules remained intact. Yet beneath that calm surface, something significant seemed to be unfolding. The deeper insiders looked, the more unusual the situation appeared. Then came the detail that transformed curiosity into genuine intrigue. Reports began suggesting that revisions had been made to a family trust connected to Highgrove itself. At first, many dismissed the claim as speculation. Royal trusts are complex structures, and revisions occur from time to time. But this rumor refused to disappear. Instead, it gathered momentum. More whispers emerged. More questions followed. Most remarkably, several accounts suggested that Camilla had not been directly involved in discussions regarding changes that could affect her own position. Detail alone was enough to spark concern among palace watchers. Camilla had long been regarded as one of the most influential figures within the king's personal circle. The idea that decisions of this magnitude could proceed without her active participation seemed almost impossible to imagine. Yet insiders continued to describe an atmosphere of extraordinary secrecy. Conversations reportedly stopped when certain individuals entered rooms. Discussions were redirected. Requests for clarification were quietly declined. Even experienced observers found themselves struggling to understand what was taking place. The uncertainty created a vacuum, and vacuums inside royal institutions are rarely left empty for long. Competing explanations quickly emerged. Some believed Charles was simply conducting routine estate planning. Others suspected a larger strategic shift involving the future stewardship of assets closely tied to his personal legacy. A few wondered whether trusted advisors had pursued a deed the king that difficult decisions could no longer be postponed. But one question continued to overshadow all others. Had Charles reached this decision entirely on his own, or had influential voices behind palace walls helped shape the outcome? As speculation intensified, attention increasingly turned toward the estate itself. Because while headlines focused on a missing name and a revised trust arrangement, those who understood Highgrove recognized that something even bigger was at stake. The real story was not merely about who was included or excluded. It was about what Highgrove represented, why it mattered so deeply to the king, and why any change connected to its future carried consequences far beyond a simple legal document. But what made the situation truly extraordinary was not the removal itself, it was the symbolic importance of the estate at the center of the storm. For decades, Highgrove was more than a country residence. It was Charles's sanctuary, his personal vision B, wrought to life, and the place where he believed his legacy would outlast headlines, scandals, and political change. That made any alteration involving Highgrove far more significant than a routine legal adjustment. Long before he became king, Charles viewed Highgrove as something deeply personal. While royal palaces carried the weight of centuries and official duties, Highgrove represented something different. It was the place where he invested not only his time, but also his convictions, his ambitions, and his understanding of what the future should look like. Through changing governments, family crises, public controversies, and shifting attitudes toward the monarchy itself, Highgrove remained one of the few constants in his life. It became inseparable from the image he hoped history would remember. That connection is what makes the recent developments so extraordinary. To understand why whispers surrounding a family trust created such intense interest within royal circles, it is necessary. Sufficient to understand what Highgrove had come to symbolize. For Charles, the estate was never merely a collection of buildings and land. It represented continuity, stability, legacy. Every decision connected to it carried emotional significance because Highgrove reflected the values he spent decades trying to promote. In many ways, it became an extension of his identity. Over time, advisors reportedly began treating the estate as a central pillar within broader discussions about Charles's long-term plans. Family trusts played an important role in those conversations. While the public often focuses on titles, ceremonies, and official announcements, trusts operate in a quieter realm. They are designed to protect assets, preserve intentions, and ensure that future generations inherit responsibilities alongside privileges. Within royal families, such arrangements often carry symbolic meaning that extends far beyond legal paperwork. They become statements about trust, stewardship, and the future, your direction of a family's legacy. As Charles grew older, those considerations reportedly became increasingly important. Questions about succession naturally expanded into questions about preservation. What would happen to the values he championed? Who would protect the institutions he spent decades nurturing? Which individuals could be trusted to carry forward the principles he believed mattered most? Highgrove sat at the center of those discussions because it represented far more than property. It represented a vision for the future. When Camilla married Charles, her own connection to Highgrove inevitably deepened. Over the years, she became an established presence within the world surrounding the estate. Publicly, their partnership appeared to strengthen with time. Together, they navigated some of the most difficult chapters of modern royal history. Together, they endured criticism, scrutiny, and constant public examination. As a result, many observers naturally assumed that Highgrove's future would remain closely linked to both of them. That assumption is precisely why recent reports generated such intense speculation. If changes were truly made to arrangements connected to the estate, then those changes could not be viewed simply as administrative adjustments. They would inevitably be interpreted as something larger, something more consequential. Within royal institutions, symbolism matters. Every inclusion sends a message. Every exclusion sends an even stronger one. The significance often lies not in the paperwork itself, but in what the paperwork appears to reveal about priorities, loyalties, and future intentions. As these discussions intensified, palace observers found themselves asking increasingly uncomfortable questions. Was Charles attempting to secure a particular vision for Highgrove's future? Had concerns emerged regarding how the estate should be managed in the decades ahead? Or was this simply a practical decision that had been transformed into a controversy by endless speculation? The answers remained hidden behind layers of confidentiality, but the questions refused to disappear. And as attention remained fixed on the estate, another realization slowly began to emerge. If Highgrove had become the focal point of a deeper struggle over legacy and influence, then the roots of that struggle likely stretched back much further than anyone initially suspected. The trust revisions may have sparked the headlines, but they were beginning to look less like the beginning of the story and more like the culmination of tensions that had been quietly building for years. Yet behind the peaceful gardens and carefully preserved traditions, tensions had reportedly been growing for much longer than anyone realized. The first clues were subtle. A canceled appearance here, a private consultation there. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger public concern. But inside royal circles, observers began noticing small shifts that suggested Charles and Camilla were no longer moving in perfect alignment on matters of family legacy. At first, almost nobody paid attention. Royal schedules change all the time. Meetings are postponed. Advisors come and go. Conversations happen behind closed doors every day. Yet when viewed individually, these developments seemed ordinary. It was only when people began connecting the dots that a different picture started to emerge. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something had changed. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But quietly, steadily, and with increasing significance. Those closest to royal affairs reportedly noticed that discussions surrounding inheritance planning had become more frequent. What had once been treated as distant concerns were now being examined with new urgency. That alone was understandable. Charles had spent much of his life preparing for the responsibilities of the crown, and as king, questions about the future inevitably carried greater weight. But according to growing speculation within palace circles, these conversations were no longer focused solely on preserving assets. They were increasingly focused on determining who would ultimately influence them. That distinction mattered, because whenever questions of legacy arise inside a royal institution, questions of loyalty soon follow. Decisions that appear administrative on the surface often conceal deeper concerns underneath. Who can be trusted? Who shares the same vision? Who will protect what previous generations worked to preserve? These are not merely financial considerations. They are emotional ones, historical ones, decisions capable of shaping relationships for years. Reports began suggesting that competing interests had quietly entered the conversation. On one side stood those who believed long-established royal traditions should remain the guiding force behind future planning. On the other stood concerns about how modern family dynamics might affect those plans moving forward. No public dispute emerged. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Yet whispers of disagreement reportedly circulated among those familiar with ongoing discussions. The issue was not simply what should be preserved, it was who should have a voice in determining how that preservation would occur. As these questions intensified, attention increasingly turned toward the future generations of the monarchy. Prince William's name reportedly surfaced more frequently during strategic conversations about stewardship and succession. For years, William had gradually assumed a larger role within royal decision-making. Now, according to insiders, his perspective was becoming harder to separate from discussions involving the institution's long-term future. Advisors trusted by both Charles and William allegedly found themselves participating in increasingly important consultations. That development carried enormous implications. The more succession planning entered the conversation, the more difficult it became to avoid uncomfortable realities. The monarchy was entering a period of transition. Charles represented continuity, but William represented the future. Every decision connected to legacy planning therefore existed at the intersection of two eras. One looking backward toward decades of accumulated responsibility. The other looking forward toward the next generation of leadership. Maintaining harmony between those perspectives required delicate balance, and according to palace observers, that balance was becoming harder to achieve. Meanwhile, rumors continued to circulate regarding the stewardship of assets connected to Charles's personal legacy. Highgrove remained central to those discussions because it embodied so much of what he hoped to leave behind. The estate was not merely an asset to be transferred. It was a symbol, a reflection of values, a statement about priorities. Any debate involving its future therefore carried emotional significance far beyond the language contained within legal documents. As strategic conversations reportedly intensified, secrecy deepened as well. Advisors became increasingly cautious. Information became increasingly difficult to obtain. Even experienced observers who had spent years following royal affairs found themselves relying on fragments rather than facts. Yet the fragments all seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Something important was being decided. Something that extended beyond routine estate planning. Something that involved competing visions of the future. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing week. Questions multiplied. Speculation expanded. And behind every rumor lingered the same unsettling possibility that a major decision had already been set in motion long before anyone outside the inner circle became aware of it. If that was true, then the public was only seeing the shadows cast by choices that had already been made behind closed doors. Then came the meeting that changed everything, a gathering so private that even some senior household figures were reportedly excluded. Late one evening, a select group of advisors quietly assembled to review documents connected to Charles's future plans. No public announcement followed. No official statement emerged. Yet those familiar with the discussions would later describe the atmosphere as unusually serious, with decisions carrying consequences far beyond property management. By this stage, the uncertainty surrounding Highgrove had evolved into something far more significant. The whispers that had once circulated quietly through royal corridors were now converging around a single moment, a single meeting, a single decision. And according to accounts that would later emerge from individuals familiar with the broader process, this gathering was unlike the countless consultations that routinely occur within royal institutions. The atmosphere was reportedly deliberate, focused, and unusually confidential. Every participant understood that the matters under discussion extended beyond routine administration. They touched the future itself. Charles had spent decades thinking about legacy. Long before his accession to the throne, he had developed strong views about stewardship, continuity, and responsibility. Those concerns became even more pressing as the monarchy entered a period of transition. Questions that could once be deferred were now demanding answers. Decisions that once seemed distant could no longer be postponed. The future was approaching faster than anyone expected, and with it came the need for clarity. It was within that context that trusted advisors reportedly gathered to conduct an extensive review of arrangements connected to Highgrove and other elements of Charles's long-term planning. Legal specialists were allegedly consulted. Financial assessments were reportedly examined. Existing structures that had remained largely untouched for years were scrutinized with fresh urgency. Nothing was assumed. Everything was reviewed. The purpose, according to growing speculation, was not merely to preserve assets but to ensure that Charles's intentions would survive long after he was no longer present to defend them personally. That distinction became increasingly important as discussions progressed. Those familiar with royal planning understand that legacy is not simply about ownership. It is about guardianship. It is about determining who will protect something once its creator is gone. Highgrove embodied that challenge perfectly. The estate represented years of personal investment and deeply held beliefs. Any decision regarding its future therefore required more than legal precision. It required confidence that the values associated with it would remain intact. Reports suggest that this question dominated much of the discussion. What mechanisms would best preserve Charles's vision? Which arrangements would provide the greatest stability? How could future uncertainty be minimized? These were not easy questions, nor were they purely technical. Every answer carried implications for relationships, influence, and future authority. As the review continued, attention reportedly shifted toward trust structures connected to the estate. Existing arrangements were allegedly reassessed. Alternative frameworks were examined. Advisors weighed competing considerations, balancing practical concerns against broader questions of continuity. The process was methodical, but beneath that methodical surface lay something deeply emotional. Decisions involving legacy are rarely detached exercises. They require individuals to confront uncomfortable realities about time, succession, and the inevitability of change. It was during these discussions that one particularly sensitive issue reportedly emerged. Camilla's role within the existing framework was allegedly reconsidered as part of the broader review. For years, her position had appeared secure. She had stood beside Charles through some of the most difficult chapters of his public life. Her influence had grown steadily over time. Yet according to persistent speculation, the advisors examining future arrangements were increasingly focused on long-term institutional priorities rather than present-day relationships. That shift in perspective may have altered everything. Because once the conversation moved beyond current circumstances and began focusing on future generations, entirely different considerations entered the equation. Discussions reportedly centered on permanence, stewardship, and succession. The goal was no longer simply to reflect the present. It was to shape the future. And when viewed through that lens, every component of the trust structure allegedly came under renewed scrutiny. Eventually, according to widespread reports, a revised framework was approved. The details remained hidden from public view, but insiders increasingly suggested that significant changes had been authorized. What exactly those changes involved remained unclear. Yet, the secrecy surrounding the process only fueled speculation. The more officials declined to comment, the more attention the story attracted. And then, just as observers struggled to understand the full significance of what had occurred behind closed doors, an even more startling development reportedly unfolded. The revisions did not remain theoretical for long. They moved from discussion to implementation with remarkable speed, creating consequences that few people outside the room had anticipated. What happened next would leave even veteran royal watchers stunned because the changes reportedly took effect far sooner than expected. By the time the revised arrangements were finalized, reports suggest the decision had already been made. What followed was not a public confrontation but something potentially more devastating: a private realization that an important chapter of influence had quietly come to an end. In many ways, that was what made the situation so remarkable. Royal disagree. Enters, when they occur, often imagined as dramatic clashes filled with visible tension and unmistakable signals. But according to growing speculation within palace circles, this moment unfolded very differently. There were no public statements, no visible disputes, no direct challenge. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: a realization, a recognition that events had moved beyond discussion and into reality. By the time word of the revised arrangements reportedly reached Camilla's circle, the critical decisions had allegedly already been finalized. The period during which opinions could influence outcomes had passed. The debates were over. The reviews had concluded. Whatever deliberations had taken place behind closed doors had already produced a result. And according to persistent whispers, that realization landed with considerable force among those who had assumed existing arrangements would remain intact. The shock reportedly extended beyond Camilla herself. Members of her broader circle allegedly struggled to understand how developments of such significance had progressed without greater visibility. For years, many had viewed her position as secure, strengthened by decades of loyalty, partnership, and public support. The possibility that a major decision connected to Highgrove could emerge without her active involvement seemed difficult to reconcile with the influence she was widely believed to possess. That question quickly became one of the most discussed aspects of the entire story. Why, observers asked, had she not played a more prominent role in the process? If the reports were accurate, why had conversations reached such an advanced stage before concerns began surfacing? Was the secrecy simply a reflection of Charles's determination to manage sensitive matters privately? Or did it suggest that certain decisions were intentionally confined to an unusually small group of trusted advisors? The absence of clear answers only intensified the speculation. Throughout palace corridors, conversations reportedly shifted from the trust itself to the circumstances surrounding its revision. Staff members, longtime observers, and individuals familiar with royal operations allegedly found themselves discussing not only what had happened, but how it had happened. The distinction mattered. In royal institutions, process often reveals as much as outcome. Who participates can be just as important as what is decided. Who is consulted can matter just as much as the final conclusion. As rumors multiplied, different interpretations emerged. Some believed Charles had simply concluded that future planning required difficult choices. Others suspected that broader institutional considerations had ultimately outweighed personal relationships. A few argued that the king's focus had increasingly shifted towards safeguarding long-term stability, even when doing so required uncomfortable decisions. Regardless of which explanation people accepted, one tie seemed impossible to ignore. The revised arrangements were being interpreted as more than administrative changes. They were being viewed as symbols, and symbols carry power. The symbolic implications of being removed from a trust associated with Highgrove extended far beyond legal terminology. For many observers, the issue touched questions of influence, proximity, and future relevance. Whether fair or not, such decisions are rarely interpreted in isolation. They become reflections of broader relationships. They invite speculation about priorities. They encourage people to search for hidden meanings beneath formal actions. That is why the reaction throughout royal circles reportedly became so intense. The story was no longer simply about documents or estate planning. It had evolved into a debate about legacy itself, about who would shape it, about who would protect it, and perhaps most importantly, about who would be entrusted with carrying it forward into the next chapter of royal history. As these conversations continued, attention gradually began moving away from Camilla's response and toward another question entirely. If such a significant decision had truly been made, who had helped guide it? Who had influenced the discussions that ultimately shaped the outcome? The more observers examined the situation, the more frequently certain names began appearing at the center of the conversation. And those names pointed toward a much larger story still waiting to unfold. But the story did not end with Camilla's reaction because attention quickly shifted toward the people believed to have influenced Charles's decision. As speculation intensified, one name repeatedly surfaced in conversations about the future direction of the monarchy. Prince William had increasingly become the figure many insiders viewed as the architect of the institution's next era. And some believed this latest move reflected that changing balance of power. The timing of the discussion was impossible to ignore. For years, William had gradually moved closer to the center of royal decision-making. It had not happened suddenly. There had been no dramatic announcement declaring a transfer of influence. Instead, it occurred through a series of small but significant developments that accumulated over time. Responsibilities increased. Consultations expanded. His voice carried greater weight. His presence became more prominent whenever conversations turned toward the future of the institution. As a result, when reports surrounding the Highgrove Trust began circulating, many observers naturally looked toward William. Not because anyone suggested he had personally directed the outcome, but because the broader themes at the center of the controversy closely mirrored priorities that had increasingly been associated with the heir to the throne. Preservation, continuity, long-term planning, protection of future generations. These were ideas that repeatedly surfaced whenever discussions focused on William's vision for the monarchy. That connection fueled growing speculation. According to palace observers, William's role had evolved considerably over recent years. He was no longer viewed simply as the future king waiting patiently for his turn. Increasingly, he was being seen as an active participant in shaping the institution that he would one day inherit. The transition was subtle but unmistakable. While Charles remained firmly at the center of royal authority, William's influence appeared to be expanding alongside it. In many ways, the monarchy was beginning to operate with one eye focused on the present and another fixed firmly on the future. That reality inevitably shaped conversations surrounding legacy. The closer William moved toward the responsibilities that awaited him, the more attention shifted toward the world he would eventually oversee. Questions about stewardship became increasingly important. What should be protected? What should be strengthened? Which traditional tians should remain untouched, and which structures required adaptation to survive the challenges ahead? These were not simple matters. They carried consequences extending far beyond individual personalities. Reports suggest that trusted advisors surrounding both Charles and William played an increasingly significant role in navigating those questions. While public attention often focuses on senior royals themselves, much of the real work occurs through consultation, planning, and careful analysis behind the scenes. Advisors tasked with protecting the institution reportedly became deeply involved in evaluating long-term priorities. Their focus was not merely on present circumstances. It was on ensuring stability decades into the future. That perspective may help explain why so many observers interpreted the Highgrove decision as part of a larger story. To many, the issue seemed to reflect an emerging reality within the monarchy. Charles represented the culmination of one chapter. William represented the beginning of another. The institution was not changing overnight, but a gradual transition appeared to be underway. Public perception increasingly reflected that belief. Every major decision was viewed through the lens of succession. Every strategic move was analyzed for clues about the future. Every adjustment sparked questions about what kind of monarchy William would eventually inherit. The significance of Highgrove therefore extended beyond the estate itself. It became intertwined with broader discussions about priorities. If Charles was taking steps to secure his legacy, what did that reveal about the future he envisioned? If certain arrangements were being revised, What values were being emphasized? And if William's influence was indeed growing, how might those values shape the next era of royal leadership? These questions captured public imagination because they touched something deeper than property or inheritance. They touched continuity. The monarchy survived, eased through its ability to bridge generations. It depends on carefully balancing tradition with adaptation, stability with renewal. Every major decision, therefore, becomes part of a larger narrative about where the institution is heading. Yet, despite all the attention focused on William, many observers eventually arrived at the same conclusion. His growing influence may have helped explain part of the story, but it did not explain all of it. There was still a deeper meaning hidden beneath the headlines, one that reached beyond individual figures and into the very heart of what Highgrove represented within the royal family. Yet even William's influence could not fully explain the deeper significance of what had just occurred. What appeared to be a simple trust adjustment was increasingly being interpreted as something larger, a symbolic declaration about who would shape the future of one of Britain's most important royal estates. And that interpretation sparked fierce debate throughout royal circles. As more people examined the implications of the decision, the conversation gradually shifted away from legal structures and towards symbolism. That shift changed everything. Trusts could be revised. Documents could be updated. Administrative arrangements could evolve over time. But symbols carried a different kind of power. They influenced perception. They shaped narratives. And once the Highgrove story entered that territory, it stopped being viewed as a routine matter and started being discussed as a defining statement about the future. At the center of that debate was a simple but deeply emotional question. What exactly did the reported removal signify? For some observers, the answer seemed obvious. They argued that the decision reflected a broader effort to preserve a particular vision of Charles's legacy. According to this interpretation, Highgrove was never merely an estate. It was the physical embodiment of values Charles had spent decades promoting. Every garden, every eve. RY initiative, every long-term project associated with the property represented principles he hoped would endure beyond his lifetime. Protecting those principles, they argued, may have become the overriding priority. Others viewed the situation differently. They believed the controversy revealed a growing tension between influence and stewardship. Influence concerns the present. Stewardship concerns the future. One is measured through relationships and proximity. The other is measured through responsibility and continuity. As speculation intensified, many commentators began asking whether the reported trust changes reflected a deliberate choice between those competing ideas. If so, the implications extended far beyond any single individual. That possibility helped explain why emotions ran so high. Throughout royal history, questions involving inheritance and succession have rarely been confined to material assets. They inevitably become debates about identity, about duty, about who is best positioned to protect a legacy once its original architect is gone. Highgrove fit perfectly into that tradition. It represented something larger than ownership. It represented custodianship. Whoever shaped its future would, in many respects, help shape the future interpretation of Charles's life's work. The discussion soon expanded into even deeper territory. Questions surrounding bloodline, responsibility, and long-term guardianship increasingly dominated conversations among royal observers. Some argued that preserving continuity required focusing on future generations who would inherit direct responsibility for the institution itself. Others countered that loyalty and commitment should carry equal weight regardless of lineage. Neither side possessed definitive answers, yet the debate revealed how profoundly symbolic the situation had become. Historical comparisons quickly followed. Veteran royal watchers pointed to previous moments when inheritance decisions created unexpected controversy. Different eras, different circumstances, yet remarkably similar themes. Every generation of the monarchy eventually confronts difficult questions about what should be preserved and who should preserve it. The names change. The personalities change. But the underlying tension remains remarkably consistent. Legacy is never simply inherited. It must be protected, interpreted, and sustained. That historical context only increased public fascination. The more attention the story received, the more people became interested in the hidden mechanisms operating behind palace walls. Public engagements and ceremonial appearances remained important, but they suddenly seemed secondary to the quieter decisions shaping the institution's future. Interest grew not because people were focused on paperwork, but because they sensed something larger unfolding beneath the surface. The reported trust revisions became a window into broader questions about succession, influence, and the direction of the monarchy itself. By now, the debate had reached a point where the specifics almost seemed less important than the meaning people attached to them. Every development was analyzed for clues. Every rumor was examined for significance. Every reported conversation generated fresh theories. Yet despite all the discussion, one mystery remained unresolved. Even those who believed they understood the outcome still struggled to answer the question that lingered over everything. Why now? Why had this decision reportedly emerged at this particular moment in royal history? Why after years of apparent stability? Why during a period already defined by uncertainty, transition, and growing attention on the future of the crown? The answer to that question, many suspected, might reveal more than any trust document ever could. As the dust began to settle, one final question remained, and it may explain why this decision happened now. In the end, the most remarkable part of the story was not the legal paperwork or the palace whispers. It was the timing. At a moment when the monarchy faces uncertainty, Charles appeared determined to define his legacy on his own terms, even if doing so risked creating one of the most talked-about royal controversies of the year. By the time the debate surrounding Highgrove reached its peak, many observers had come to the same conclusion. The story was never truly about a trust. It was never solely about influence, access, or administrative arrangements. Those elements may have captured the headlines, but beneath them lay something far deeper. This was ultimately a story about legacy. About a king confronting the reality that time moves forward whether institutions are ready for it or not. About a monarch deciding how he wanted to be remembered when future generations looked back on the choices he made during one of the most challenging periods of his reign. That is why the timing matters so much. The monarchy currently stands at a unique crossroads. Is an institution rooted in centuries of tradition, yet it must constantly adapt to a rapidly changing world. Charles inherited that challenge when he became king, but he also inherited something else. The responsibility to ensure that what he leaves behind remains strong enough to survive long after his own chapter has ended. Every major decision now exists within that context. Every choice is measured not only by its immediate consequences but also by its long-term impact on the future of the crown. According to those who have closely followed developments surrounding Highgrove, this broader perspective may explain why recent reports generated such intense interest. The estate represents far more than land and property. It embodies decades of personal dedication, carefully cultivated ideals, and a vision that Charles spent much of his life developing. Protecting that vision may have become one of his most important priorities. And if that is true, then the reported trust revisions too. Key on an entirely different meaning. Rather than viewing them as reactions to present circumstances, some observers believe they should be understood as preparations for the future. That future inevitably includes questions about influence. For years, Camilla occupied an important position within Charles's personal and public life. No discussion of recent royal history can ignore the role she played in helping him navigate extraordinary challenges. Yet institutions often operate according to different principles than personal relationships. They are designed to outlast individuals. They are built to endure transitions. And when decisions are made with future generations in mind, priorities can sometimes shift in unexpected ways. If the reports are accurate, the implications for Camilla's future influence may be significant. Not because any formal role has changed publicly, but because symbolism has power. Perception matters. The way decisions are interpreted often shapes public understanding, and as much as the decisions themselves. That reality helps explain why the story attracted such widespread attention. People sensed that something larger was being communicated beneath the surface. At the same time, the conversation naturally turns toward William. Throughout this story, his presence has lingered in the background as a reminder of the monarchy's next chapter. Whether directly involved or not, his future role has become impossible to separate from discussions about succession, stewardship, and continuity. Every decision tied to legacy inevitably raises questions about what kind of institution he will inherit and what responsibilities will accompany that inheritance. The growing perception that a gradual transition is already underway only intensifies those questions. And that brings us back to Highgrove itself. Perhaps the estate's greatest significance lies not in what it is today, but in what it represents for tomorrow. It stands as a symbol of continuity between generations, a bridge connecting Charles's personal vision with whatever future awaits the monarchy. The discussions surrounding its stewardship therefore reveal something essential about the challenges facing every royal generation. The task is never simply to preserve what exists. It is to determine how that legacy should evolve while remaining true to the values that created it. That is why one quiet decision generated such extraordinary attention. It touched issues that resonate far beyond a single estate or a single family. It raised questions about duty, responsibility, inheritance, and the delicate balance between personal loyalty and institutional survival. Long after the speculation fades and the headlines disappear, those questions will remain. Because while headlines may focus on who was removed from the trust, history may ultimately remember something far more important: the moment King Charles decided exactly who would carry the future of Highgrove long after he is gone. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.